Let's do this.
This is Fantasy Intervention. Now here to intervene with your fantasy life, Chase Vernon.
What is going on, guys? Welcome on into yet another episode of Fantasy Intervention. Yes, I know. I still have to fix that whole sound thing for the live videos, guys. I get it. I got to fix it. I just need some time in order to do it. But yeah, what's going on, guys? We have yet another episode coming to hit you in the face. And yes, we have Turkey Day. Turkey Day, one of my favorite days of the entire year, primarily just because of football. But, you know, food is always a plus, too. So is family, I guess. But now, absolutely love my family, love you guys out there. So hope you guys do enjoy a phenomenal Thanksgiving with family members, with friends, with everybody else that you guys would actually share it with, pets, whoever it is. But of course, my favorite part of this actual Thanksgiving day is football. And every single year, right, we get to sit there and break down two teams that are always playing on Thanksgiving, right? We normally have the Cowboys and the Lions. And yeah, we get to enjoy from time to time some pretty good matchups. Now, they added in a night game for Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, that is getting postponed to Sunday. So not too stoked about that. But you know what? It is what it is. Now, when we sit there, right, and when you have like these Thanksgiving days, especially with COVID being here, there are always a few guys that kind of slip through the cracks on Thanksgiving Day. There's certain guys that not everybody's looking at, or certain guys that you expect to go off where everybody's talking about this one guy. And then you can end up just getting screwed over. Like, that's the reality of the situation. You end up getting fucked. You get bent over. And the reality is when you sit there and you break it down and you just take these, individual games, right? And you try to look them as a whole and you say, oh my God, Randall Cobb is out, right? He's going on IR. That must mean that Keke Coutee is automatically going to start getting snaps, right? Because he's a slot wide receiver. That's what he does, Kenny Stills is on the outside. There's no way. There's no way that anybody else is going to get those snaps. Keke Coutee is a bomb play. The reality is that's actually going to screw a lot of people over this upcoming week if they don't look at it as a whole. If they don't look at the entire matchup over there and realize, like, hey, I still want him in a few lineups, but playing him in every single one and expecting him to pay off might just be a little bit asinine. So, it's both true statements like we talk about when it comes to Keke Coutee playing in the slot and Cobb going out. So I'm not sitting there saying don't play Keke Coutee, but understand that with the versatility of the Texans offense and how they end up rounding out their wide receiver corps, it ends up creating plenty of opportunity for not just Keke Coutee, but also Kenny Stills coming and play on the outside, the two tight end sets to, take over, obviously with Akins being back. And, essentially Will Fuller to potentially get some snaps in the slot, or Brandon Cooks. I mean, we sit there and we look at it, and the combined two players when it comes to Brandon Cooks and Will Fuller, they play 54% of the time out of the slot. So yeah, I actually think that Kenny Stills could be a play, and I'm not locked into Keke Coutee being a guy. He's not a free square like most of these other people are talking about. So big shout out, by the way, to Mike, my co-host for tonight's show. That's going to be on at 8 o'clock tonight. We've got Michael Hoffman there. It's going to be absolutely insane. And of course, Cooter Doodles premiere, her debut on our show tonight. I'm stoked. I cannot wait for it. I'm excited. I love this show, but I'm actually looking forward to tonight's show even more. So anyways, guys, it's something as to where, like, it's not exactly obvious of who to play in these matchups. And there's so many different combinations of, ways that you can go and routes you can go, because it's just, it's going to be weird how, I guess, volatile each one of these receivers are going to be and have been to an extent when it comes to the tournament plays for DFS. Not to mention the fact that half of Detroit's defense and their secondary is just torn up over there. It's going to be a massacre on both sides of the ball to an extent. And I'm very interested to see where this goes, especially with the injury reports not coming out yet. So I do want to sit there and say that I'm going to scratch two guys off my list right off the bat. One guy that I'm scratching off my list, and that's going to be Andy Dalton, right? He was coming off of a bye this past week up against Minnesota, and he threw 3 touchdowns, right? Oh, it's so great. He threw 3 touchdowns. But, I mean, we talk about, like, acrobatic catches and saving people's ass. Like, if you saw that CeeDee Lamb catch in the end zone, I mean, Dalton might not have had those 2 touchdowns. Plus, he only put up 203 yards up against Minnesota. Minnesota, I believe that's either the worst or the second worst offensive output by a quarterback this entire season when it comes to yardage allowed or yardage put up. So the Washington defense is nasty, right? We saw them tear apart Andy Dalton. And this offensive line, a few weeks ago now, their offensive line was a little bit more dissipated than what it is right now. But I do not love Andy Dalton. And I don't think any situation as to where I feel comfortable playing him. So I'm going to scratch him off my list right off the bat so you guys are not looking for Andy Dalton, for those of you who might have tried to find some silver lining. Alex Smith was kind of like a sneaky sleeper play this week, so I might still play him in a contrarian lineup. I'm going to go over that here in a little bit. But yeah, Andy Dalton is not an option. But let me go ahead and break down these matchups because there is one guy that's going to be complete chalk. He's probably going to be the most owned player on the slate, and that is Deshaun Watson, right? Deshaun Watson, like, you have 2 options, right? You can either eat him, like eat the chalk, which I'm probably going to do in like 60% of my lineups. I might have more Deshaun Watson, the whole rest of the slate has. But, when it comes to percentages at least. But, I mean, you either go that route and you believe in Watson, which he's been playing as Bo put it, hero ball, or you can end up pivoting. And the reasons why you would pivot off Watson, right, is you either think that the Texans are going to go up big and, maybe post first quarter, they're just going to go super heavy on the run. We talk about how bad the Detroit defense is when it comes to stopping the running back. And Duke Johnson, back a few weeks ago, had a good game. He struggled as of late, but it's something as to where you could see Duke Johnson getting the majority of the workload. Even what's his name, Buddy Howe has a chance to do it. You also have CJ Procise over there. So I'm not saying that you're locked into this, but that is one of the thinkings. Hey, maybe Deshaun Watson doesn't go off because Duke Johnson handles the majority of the workload this week. They just put Deshaun Watson in a short and third situations, and he doesn't have to play hero ball. He doesn't have to run for his life. So that's the first thing that I'd be looking at if I'm trying to fade Deshaun Watson. The second thing is you think Alex Smith, although he has not been relevant when it comes to throwing touchdowns, he still gets the same amount of yardage that he's been getting, but he actually throws 2 to 3 touchdowns in this upcoming game. And Antonio Gibson isn't that involved, especially when it comes to the red zone. Now, I don't really see that because Washington's one of the most run-heavy teams in the red zone in the entire NFL. But I could see where you could, possibly, I guess, bank on that, especially in tournaments where you're kind of hoping for, certain things to bounce your way. The last aspect that you'd be looking at if you're going to fade Deshaun Watson is Stafford isn't affected as much by his thumb injury. He gets up, or he ends up being in a losing situation for the majority of the game, and he can actually compete with Deshaun Watson's, passing numbers. He can actually compete with Deshaun Watson as a whole. And Stafford has been there in certain weeks, and he's shown that he can produce. But when it comes to Deshaun Watson numbers, like, that is very, very difficult to actually get up and produce at that high-end level. So I'm not loving Stafford this week, but I could see how you could fade and go with Stafford in certain lineups. Now, with that being said, I was hoping that Lamar Jackson would play. I thought that I could actually pivot over to Lamar Jackson. And then, of course, we have Ben Roethlisberger. Same deal. I felt like I could have actually pivoted to those guys and faded Deshaun Watson. Now that they're out of this lineup for tomorrow's games, I mean, like I said, Deshaun Watson's going to be in a very, very, very heavy amount of my lineups. And I'm going to try and find other ways to actually fade, right? I'm going to try and find other contrarian lineups to differentiate myself from the rest of the tournaments. Now, all three of the scenarios we talked about are possible, but you're talking about Watson, who could actually, combine for 4 touchdowns between his rushing ability and his passing ability, maybe in 5 touchdowns. And like we talked about, the secondary is completely beat up, just demolished. So where do we build Watson? What do we stack with him, and where do we go? Now, if you go Watson, then the chalk is obviously going to be on Cooks and on Filler, right? It could be on either one or it could be both attached. And I don't hate either one of these guys because, like I talked about, when the episode started, they've moved both of these guys around constantly. Like they are constantly shifting these guys all over the lineup. So to sit there and think that Fuller is going to be the guy because he's going to see true fonts, or maybe the guy in the slot is going to be the guy, like that's the wrong way of thinking this upcoming week. But I do like Fuller, right? I'm not leaning Fuller because of the fact that Fuller has a bigger upside, because I think that both him and Cooks have about an equal upside, effect. But right now, like looking at it, we talk about Cooks pricing being at 5,300. Like that's, in a lot of people's minds, too cheap. It's too cheap. So the chalk is going to be on Cooks more so than Fuller when it comes to my outlook on this. Meanwhile, when we sit there and look at it, Fuller's been kind of like in a cold streak to an extent over the past 2 games compared to, what I guess the perceived value is of Fuller. But we saw him with 6 straight games with a touchdown, right? 6 straight games with a touchdown. He didn't have a touchdown over the past 2 games. So what? He had a tough matchup, right? They had, Denzel Ward in one of the matchups. It's just something as to where I think that Fuller's going to be lesser owned. So I'm going to lean more on the Fuller side and hope that his, upside value comes to fruition. But yeah, when we sit there, right, and we look at the pricing for Cooks and the perception of his value being too low at 5,300, that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Like, why is 5,300 too low? Because as I look at it with these matchups, there's only been 3 weeks where he's actually paid off in a tournament setting. And one of those matchups was like borderline paying off. I mean, I'm sitting there and looking at the majority of you pretty much wasting money from week to week playing Brandon Cooks when it comes to his value at 5,300. Now, sure, he could absolutely go off and have 35 fantasy points, and that's where you bank. That's where you make a ton of money. But you only make a ton of money if you're going contrarian with either, him, if people don't think he's going to go off, or if you end up playing the rest of your lineup being contrarian. So to not only take a shot on Brandon Cooks with his, value actually not hitting on a regular basis, in combination with the fact that he's probably going to be chalk, I don't love playing Brandon Cooks this week. I'm actually probably going to fade him. I'll have him in probably 10% of my lineups, but I'm not going to be throwing him in every single one. Do not go heavy on Brandon Cooks if you want to make some money. That's called chasing the dragon. So a little bit less than chasing the dragon, but it's still chasing the dragon to an extent. Now I'm sitting there, right, and I'm looking at some of these other plays that are chalky that I would actually rather play over him. And, Terry McLaurin might be a little bit too outpriced in order to get him in the lineups, but I'd rather play a chalky option like that, or maybe CeeDee Lamb, than go with the Brandon Cooks chalk in this matchup. So if I don't play Cooks, right, if we don't go Cooks, we end up going, let's just say Fuller is one of the options. I like the idea of getting Duke Johnson, right, a heavier carry count in this game that could end up being a blowout. I like Duke Johnson a lot, and I think that you can still pair him with Watson. I think that it creates a slightly contrarian lineup as to where, hey, Watson could end up getting 3 or 4 touchdowns, and then they just go into run-heavy offenses. And with Detroit's defense being as porous as they are, you could still see some big plays happen out of Duke Johnson, along with volume, especially towards the second half. The issue with Duke Johnson is the fact that you have so many other running backs that you can actually play in this lineup. Meanwhile, you can only play like 3 running backs as a whole. So which running backs are you going to go with? If you end up playing Duke Johnson, it makes sense, and I want to play Duke Johnson in there with Will Fuller in quite a few contests. But then I got to sit there and figure out whether I want to go to Swift, or I want to go to Gibson, or I want to go to Elliott or Pollard. Like all these guys make sense, and they provide a certain amount of upside. And even J.D. McKissick, who I'm going to go through here in a little bit, and I don't like this upcoming week, makes sense. If Swift doesn't play, both Peterson and Kerryon Johnson, they make sense. So it's something as to where I'm actually playing Duke Johnson in a good amount of my lineups with Watson in there, but it's not going to be every single one. I still want about 25% share with Watson in my lineups because I do think the contrarian play could pay off. In lineups without Sean Watson, I'm going to go very heavy on Duke Johnson. Now, as for the other plays in this stack, right? I mean, we're looking at the tight ends, we're looking at the wide receivers, and I'm going to start out with Kiki Kuti, where I'm going to test it out, right? I'm going to sit there and I'm going to throw him in a few lineups. And believe it or not, I think that you can actually stack him with Duke Johnson as well. So if you go Watson, Duke Johnson, and Kuti, you're already going to get away from the rest of the tournament that is starting Watson, because you're not playing Will Fuller and you're not playing Cook. So when we sit there and we look at the opportunities, we can go chalk with the entire rest of our lineup. If we go Watson, Duke Johnson, and Kiki Kuti, and you can actually play. I went there and I threw a few of the guys in there. You can pretty much play the most expensive guys at every other position if you play Watson, Duke Johnson, and Kiki Kuti. So you can get Ezekiel Elliott, you can get Terry McLaurin, you can get Hawkinson, you can get all these guys into your lineup if you end up going that route and playing Kuti with Duke Johnson as a Watson stack. So that makes sense. Now, if we sit there and we look at it, we take out the Carolina game, right, where the Carolina Panthers don't use tight ends. The previous 3 games prior to that, the Lions have given up at least 50 yards to the tight end position and then 3 touchdowns combined, right? So in those 3 games, 3 touchdowns combined and at least 50 yards receiving to the tight end position. So if you want to pull Kiki Kuti out, you don't feel safe with him, or maybe you don't even feel safe with Duke Johnson, right? And you want to go maybe Fuller and a tight end, it makes sense. It makes sense. But I will say is that I don't know which tight end I would actually go with. Akins is working his way back into the starting lineup, and he looked great last week. But that's not guaranteed with Akins week in and week out. Meanwhile, Fells is the blocking tight end, but he can always go out for a pass. Meanwhile, we have Pharaoh Brown, I believe. He's a guy that ends up blocking a ton as well, but he gets red zone targets. Or could end up getting red zone targets. So I don't love any one of these tight ends individually. But it does make sense to play tight end because the tight ends in this lineup for this Thursday slate are absolutely insane. Their values for this lineup, their ownership for the lineup, these Texans tight ends might be 10% owned, and that includes Akins and Fells. So I think that it's an okay pivot, and I think it's very contrarian, and I think that it's a good way to go with that. You could also go, by the way, with a double tight end stack. So if you decide to go wide receiver heavy and if you decide to go top end running back heavy, you could actually do a double stack with the flex position and the tight end and play 2 tight ends. It is playable this week. And I think that both Fells and Akins offers upside. But whatever one I'm playing Akins in, I'm also going to be playing Fells in. So I pretty much just said start every Texans player. And that's just because how bad this Detroit defense is. And it's tough for me to sit there and pick individual players. But yeah, that's a good job by me, right? Good job by me. I'm being very decisive. But honestly, there's just too much goodness over there, right? There's too much sweet nectar to just suckle at when we sit there and we look at the opportunity on the Texans side. I mean, I love every Texans player. I think the only one that I'm fading heavy is going to be Brandon Cook, but I still like him. So, Brandon Cooks. Anyways, Swift, if he plays, is an absolute lock for me. I don't care if he's chalk. I don't care if he's not. He's going to be in more lineups than Deshaun Watson is, and that's going to be without a doubt. He's going to be a smash play up against the Texans, who, by the way, the worst rush defense in the NFL is the Texans. The second worst is the Lions. Or wait, it's the other way around. The worst is the Lions. The second worst is the Texans. So Swift has some huge opportunity. Plus, he can catch passes. Plus, we know that the Lions love this guy. I mean, look, they spent 1 week without him up against Carolina, who was a very easy team to run against, and they just could not get the ball moving. So Swift is that guy now. If he plays, which I believe he got in, I believe he is playing. I think he's locked into play. I think he passed concussion protocol and he got a full practice in. I love Swift for this matchup. Now, Galladay and Hawkinson, or maybe that was Antonio Gibson that got approved. I'm going to check back on that. Make sure you guys pay attention to the injury report. Anyways, Galladay and Hawkinson are major options if they play as well. You know, we talk about Galladay. He had a massive game last year up against the Bears on Turkey Day, so he loves that prime time spotlight, and I think he'd absolutely go off again this year. But Hawkinson, who has a better chance of playing because Galladay is trending in the wrong direction, Hawkinson is a sexy, sexy play for me this week. He's the most expensive on tight end, and if you decide to go top heavy in a lot of these lineups and you play Deshaun Watson and you try to fit in Cooks, you try to fit in Fuller, you're not going to be able to fit in Hawkinson if you want to go high end on the other side. So I think that the run back with Hawkinson and Swift as well is going to be very, very difficult to kind of fit into people's lineups. So I like Hawkinson running back, and I like to play Swift in that same lineup if they both play. Now, we talk about Stafford. If you want to go on that other side, like I said, and fade Hawkinson, be my guest, because guess what? Swift is great in the passing game, right? Hawkinson's great, obviously, in the passing game. I want to play both guys with Stafford. However, I'm not going to overload my lineups with it. I don't want to get too contrarian with this matchup. Like I said, Deshaun Watson for me is going to be the highest scoring quarterback, and I don't really see a way that it could not happen outside of the ways we discussed, which is a very low percent chance. But if we sit there, right, and we want to try to fit in some of these, I guess, cheaper guys, because we do want to go with Fuller, and we don't trust Hawkinson because he might not play, and we don't trust Swift because he might not play, or he might be on a snap count. We talk about my favorite play on this entire slate for Thursday games, and that's going to be Marvin Jones Jr. Marvin Jones Jr. up against Vernon Hargreaves. I think that's an absolute smash. I think it's an absolute smash over there. It's crazy, right? Because we break it down. If you guys follow me on Twitter, FF_intervention, you guys will see a lot of my stuff that I do for my DFS. But when we break it down, right, since week 7, these are Marvin Jones stat lines. 5 for 80, 3 for 39, 2 touchdowns, 3 for 51, a touchdown, 3 for 43, a touchdown, 8 for 96, a touchdown. And last week he went 4 for 51. And then he actually had a 51-yard touchdown called back because of an illegal formation, which absolutely drove me insane. Insane. Like he would have had another 100-yard game with 2 touchdowns, right? Or no, with a touchdown, which would have put him up there. Right now, he is, if you include that touchdown in there, like if that didn't get taken away, he's actually wide receiver 7 above DK Metcalf. Without that, he's still wide receiver 11 since week 7. So I absolutely love Marvin Jones Jr. in this matchup, especially if Golladay doesn't play, because Houston is 23rd in explosive play percentage allowed. 6 out of 10 games that they played so far this season were against teams in the bottom half of explosive plays for their offense. 5 out of 10 were in the bottom 10 of explosive plays for their offense. So they're 23rd, yet they have not played a whole bunch of teams that have explosive plays constantly. I absolutely love Marvin Jones Jr. in this matchup. Now, Danny Amendola, if he plays, I could see him with like an Adam Humphries type stat line, like, 4 receptions for 40 yards and a touchdown or something, but that's his upside. So for cash games, I could see how you could play him. However, with Golladay out, I'm not going to touch him. It would still make for a contrarian play, which I like, but Eric Murray's actually been really solid so far in the slot, especially as of late. So I'm not going to be playing Amendola. I'm not really going to be touching him. We talk about him and Agnew being complete fades for me. Not going to touch him. But it makes sense if you go with like Sean Watson, and then you want to go with Fuller and Cooks, and you want to throw that random underneath type target, in this lineup to make it contrarian. As for Marvin Hall, I can see a play here, but Roby's been actually really good, or Roby's been really good so far this year. And it's something as to where I'm going to fade Hall just because I don't see the upside, being there for me. I would much rather go with Marvin Jones Jr., who could absolutely explode, go with a Swift or Hawkinson, who are almost guaranteed points if they play. And as for Quintez Cephas, I love Quintez Cephas, but I don't like his snap count. It's been dropping like a rock as of late. And yeah, he makes sense as a contrarian dart throw that can make, that could fit in your lineups later, but that's something that I might have in one lineup, if that. Now, doubling back to the running backs, right? Because we talked about Swift, talked about Hawkinson. If, let's just say, Hawkinson does not play, I will have a few shares of Jesse James. I don't love it, but I will have a few shares of Jesse James because of his pricing. And he makes a lot of these higher-end guys able to play, especially in the running back position. When it comes to Swift, I like Kerryon Johnson more than I like Adrian Peterson. The hope is that the Texans will pretty much go up, right? So the Lions are losing, and all of a sudden, Kerryon Johnson has to be used in this passing game. This past week up against Carolina, it did not look good, but we know that Matthew Stafford was not comfortable, with this thumb. I'm hoping that changes this week, and I'm hoping that Kerryon Johnson does get used in the passing game. Meanwhile, Peterson, he's going to have to be winning. He's going to have to be up, or they're going to have to see a bunch of red zone opportunities. I don't see that happening. So I'm going to be fading Peterson in a major way, although I will have him in one lineup if Swift does not play. If Swift does not play and Kerryon Johnson's out there, I will be playing, probably 10% of my lineups with Kerryon Johnson in hopes that he has a couple breakaway runs. He's not the best running back in the world. In fact, I have never been a Kerryon person, but he does have the potential to have that breakaway run, especially, or the breakaway, reception, especially up against the Texans. So, oh man, if we sit there, right, and we look at the matchups, we're obviously going to be focusing heavy on the Detroit Lions versus the Texans, but we still have the Cowboys up against the Washington football team. So this matchup I'm extremely skeptical about. I think the over-under is like 46 or something. So it could happen. They could get to that, but I really don't see how they get to 46 points. So I want to minimize my plays in this, but there still are plays that I think you can capitalize on, right? If Dallas can't protect that quarterback, right, which is something that I could see happening. I mean, they moved, Connor McGovern over to guard, and they, of course, moved Martin over to right tackle. So this is something as to where, like, they're kind of shifting this offensive line, and sure, it worked, right? Zach Martin, that is. It worked against the Vikings, but the Vikings can't provide pressure. So up against Washington, it's a different animal. We saw them, a few weeks ago. We saw them a few weeks ago completely struggle at trying to stop Washington's pass rush, and Dalton could end up, seeing a very similar outcome to what he saw up against Washington last time. Now, he might be a little bit more prepared for it this time, but it's still not going to be good news. The receivers weren't the only people affected, by the way, when it came to Dak actually getting out and the offensive line getting hurt, because Zeke, huge hit. And it was brutal, right? Like, he was an RB1 prior to the injury, but 3 things happened that completely, dissipated this, I guess, outlook for Ezekiel Elliott. The yards per carry dropped slightly. It wasn't that big of a deal, but they still did drop. His red zone touches were completely decimated, so that definitely had a big part to do with it. I mean, we saw, red zone touch after red zone touch, but now the Dallas Cowboys aren't able to get in the red zone because they can't move the offense. So when that happens, we don't see Ezekiel Elliott put up big time points. His touchdown, what was it? A touchdown run on this past game up against Minnesota. I believe that was red zone carry. So if he's not getting in the red zone, he's not going to score. It's going to be very tough to do that up against Washington. The biggest thing, however, is that his targets completely disappeared. He went from 167 route runs over the first 5 games down to 102 route runs over the last 5. Meanwhile, the team has actually ran 2 more snaps per game than the past 5 games compared to the first 5 games. This has actually resulted in 13 targets less and 97 less yards over the past 5 weeks. So Zeke is getting crushed, man. He's getting crushed not only from the lack of red zone, but from the targets and his ability to break big time plays. Now, with that being said, like I brought up, I don't think it's going to get any, better up against Washington. I mean, the Lions, right? They figured out Washington can't cover the running back in space, but that might be that might be where Tony Pollard benefits, because Tony Pollard is taking away passing downs from Ezekiel Elliott. So I don't know that Zeke actually gets up to that point where we can actually find his value being the most expensive running back on the slate. Now, will I still play Ezekiel Elliott? Yeah, I think that he's a great play, especially when you want to try and find a contrarian type matchup if you are going to play Cooks and if you are going to play Fuller. Because guess what? You're going to have to go super cheap and super flyer like on these other players. If you play Zeke, you play Fuller, you play Deshaun Watson, and you play Cooks. You're going to have to end up having some of these lower end guys. So I don't think that they're going to share a ton of ownership. But I will say that Zeke is going to be a major fade overall for me. I just can't see where he can get you, 2 touchdowns and 100 yards up against Washington. They've just been too good. Now, where I am going to attack is going to be with Pollard to an extent. I'm not going to have a ton of shares of Pollard, but I'm going to have a few shares of him as a flyer. But the receiver position, you can actually find a little bit of value with. I know it's a little bit scary to go out there and play receiver up against Washington. They've been pretty good overall. But Jimmy Moreland has kind of been exposed up against bigger, more physical, more dominant type slot receivers. I'm not calling like Sterling Shepard dominant or anything, but he is a little bit bigger and more physical than what Jimmy Moreland is used to so far in the season. And, these type of receivers have kind of, produced at an okay level. Now, with Lamb, I know that he was only targeted once while covered by Jimmy Moore this past matchup in week 7. But I think that Andy Dalton is going to look his way a little bit more often and look to get the ball out of his hands, way faster than what he did. So we could see CeeDee Lamb with, 7, 8 receptions and, 70 yards, 60 yards, but have a touchdown or 2 in this game. So I'm looking for Lamb to succeed in this game, and I think I'm going to have a decent amount of shares with Lamb. Now, the upside play, this is an upside play, pure upside. It could absolutely bust on you, right? Very low floor, huge ceiling, is Michael Gallup. Washington, surprisingly, right? Like, Washington has been very good up against wide receivers this year. They've actually been dominant. And they're 4th, right? They're 4th when it comes to the least amount of explosive plays allowed, which are passes or receptions that go for over 20 yards, right? They've actually been really good so far this season at preventing passes over 20 yards. But the thing is when they actually allow these big plays to happen, they allow big plays to happen. Like, I'm talking about massive, massive plays. They allowed the second most receptions so far this season, over 40 yards, and the most amount of receptions for over 50 yards. So they're not allowing a ton of plays over 20 yards. When they do go over 20 yards, we're talking about 40 or 50 yards and a touchdown in a lot of these cases. So it's a lot of blown coverages, right? It's a lot of, plays where a defender actually gets burned, on a double move or whatever the case is, and does not have safety help over the top. So Gallup for me is a smash if I'm looking for that high end upside. And if I'm sitting there and I'm going with a Dallas, has to come back sort of play, Andy Dalton likes Michael Gallup. We've seen him target Michael Gallup on multiple different occasions. And I know it wasn't great for the game up against Washington. I know this past week he only completed maybe 2 passes for 29 yards, but he did target him downfield, I believe 3 more times. So I do like Michael Gallup in this matchup, and I think that he can smash. And by the way, this is a huge contrarian play. I expect Michael Gallup's ownership to be below 10% this week. Like that's like max. So when we sit there and we look at Dalton Schultz at the tight end position, he's another pass catcher. That's more of an obvious play, and I think he's going to have a decent amount of ownership, especially at his price. So be a little bit careful when it comes to trying to play like Dalton Schultz with your Deshaun Watson, et cetera. I don't need to go through, that stack again, but just be very cautious when it comes to that, and make sure you guys aren't going over the top with Dalton Schultz. I still think that he could play, and I think that he could finish up with a touchdown. I think he'd have a very good game overall, but it's not somebody that I'm trying to jam in every single one of my lineups and trying to make work, right? I'd much rather play a Hawkinson who has a higher upside, in my opinion, or God, I'd probably rather play Akins or Fells over Dalton Schultz at their pricing. It's just that crazy. Logan Thomas is another guy that I'm talking about that I'd probably rather play than Schultz. So I do like Schultz. I do think that you can play him, but I'm not trying to jam in every single one, especially when I have a lot of chalk, because I do think that he's going to be heavy chalk this week. As for Washington, right? As long as Gibson plays, he's going to be a lock for me. And I believe that he did a full practice today. I think I mixed that up earlier, saying that Swift did. I think that Gibson got in a full practice today. I think that he's good to go. And, we sit there, and every single week that I bring up Dallas and the running back, we talk about how Dallas is actually really good up against, pass catching running backs. I mean, they're really good. The most amount of yards they've allowed to a running back was this past week, when it comes to running backs in the air, was this past week up against Dalvin Cook. Meanwhile, you can run all over this Dallas defense. So they're terrible about stopping the run. They're great at stopping the receptions from the running back. So I think that Gibson is a smash. Meanwhile, I am fading McKissick hard, like real hard. I think in the last matchup, he had like 2 receptions on 16, or 2 receptions for 16 yards. Chidobe Awuzie, that's what it is. God, I was like, wait, I know this name, Awuzie. Chidobe Awuzie. He's getting torn up by McLaurin. He's going to get torn up. That's what's going to happen. I love McLaurin, and I don't see any reason as to fade him. Like, it's something as to where, like, I can't trust any other guy, because they do have 4 other receivers on this offense that are going to get snaps. They're going to get targets. I just don't know which one's going to go off. And I think there's enough variation as to where you don't have to try and chase that flyer guy unless you're playing a very chalk heavy lineup. Now, when we talk about this, right, and we try to discuss which one is actually going to be the guy, if you do play a chalk heavy lineup, we have Cam Sims, who's looked great so far, but Inman's coming back this week, and he's like a red zone love for Scott Turner. Like, Scott Turner loves targeting in the red zone. I don't really get it, but I mean, he's been good, but yeah, he likes using Inman. I don't think that Inman is going to get used enough, because Cam Sims has looked so good. So I don't think that Inman is going to see a full-on snap share. But then when they get the red zone, it could be Inman time. So I don't like either one of these guys. It's pretty much a dart throw at that point, where there's a good chance that neither one of them go off. And when you have a matchup like this where you do have other viable options, I'd rather not take a dart throw on that. Meanwhile, Isaiah Wright, his usage has gone down since Steven Sims' usage has gone up. But he was active one week, then not the next. We're seeing what Robert Foster from the Bills, the old Bill star, he was active this past week, but didn't do anything, wasn't even targeted. So if I had to pick one receiver to be this flyer, to be the contrarian play, if you want to go heavy on this Texans game, and you guys might, like, I had a huge conflict on this. Like, this is what, like, tearing me apart on the inside. We look at Steven Sims Jr., and I hate Steven Sims Jr. Like, this guy's undersized. He has small hands. He has no college production. Like, he dropped the ball. He just saw a great opportunity towards the tail end of last season. Everybody's like, oh, this is the guy. He's not the guy. But this week, I think that my hate for Jordan Lewis, or my love to play receivers up against Jordan Lewis, is overcoming Steven Sims. I really do. Like Jordan Lewis, I want to play him everywhere. So Steven Sims Jr. is an option for me. He might see some coverage up against Jordan Lewis. And if he does see that coverage, he could take advantage of him in multiple different situations, being a little bit quicker and shiftier, question mark. I think that Steven Sims Jr., with the targets that he could end up getting and with the play calling and the way that Scott Turner likes to run this offense, I think that Steven Sims Jr., out of all of these dart throws, he's probably my favorite one if I had to pick one, which is gross. Let's move on to something not as gross, and let's talk about Logan Thomas, right? Logan Thomas is a play for me, but I'm not going to go over the top with him, very similar to Dalton Schultz. His upside is very limited, but he has an amazing floor. And so if you're somebody that thinks that you're going to play like these Michael Gallup, type plays, and you want that floor and try and capitalize off of the upside of some of these other plays, I think Logan Thomas is probably the perfect play for you. I love matching up Logan Thomas and even having in some Antonio Gibson, some Washington Redskins or Washington football team's defense, and then run it back with Gallup. I think that you're talking about some high-end upside over there with Gallup, like we talked about with Antonio Gibson. Meanwhile, you're not going to lose with Logan Thomas in your lineups. I love Logan Thomas to not only come away with a touchdown in this one, but to probably end up with right around 6 to 7 receptions. He's never seen less than 4 targets on the season. Never. So I expect this target to go up as he gets more comfortable with Alex Smith, and I think he absolutely smashes. Yeah, and that's going to wrap it up for us. So just a little bit of a recap. We're going to be playing a lot of Deshaun Watson this week. A lot of Deshaun Watson, a lot of Swift if he's healthy, a lot of Antonio Gibson. Listen, I appreciate you guys for tuning in to this episode. If you guys want to check it out. Oh, Danny's out. Good call. Danny Amendola's out. If you guys want to check us out on Twitter, go ahead and check us out at FF_intervention and join our circle _. Join our circle _. Make sure you guys check us out. Make sure you guys go check out all the quick shots on YouTube. And make sure you guys tune in tonight. Make sure you guys tune in tonight for our episode. We're going to be answering all of your questions for Starter Sit. We're going to have Mike on. We're going to have Mike, 2 mics on. We're going to have 2 mics on. We're going to have Cooter Doodle. Oh, is Galladay out? I know he's on the track to not play, but anyways, we're going to have Cooter Doodle on. It's going to be her debut. I cannot be more excited. Thank you guys for tuning in. Check us out tonight at 8 o'clock, and thank you guys for letting us intervene with your fantasy football life.